Okay, welcome everybody to the Monday, July 31st, 2017 meeting of Kubernetes SIG service catalog. As Jimmy Zielinski has observed, nearly everybody has their webcam on, so this will probably be a very interesting meeting. Let's see. First up on the agenda today is further discussion on broker relist behavior. Aaron, would you like to be the objective facilitator?
Yep.
Muscle memory, man.
Yes.
Sorry.
No worries. Can everybody hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes. Okay. So just a reminder, we're going to do speaker queue again today. So if you have commentary you want to add, type this in the chat, plus hand. I'll put you at the end of the speaker queue with my highly technology speaker queue system, pen and paper. And we are going to start in the agenda here with Paul talking about per broker relist behavior, and that is issue number 705. I'm going to include a link to the document here. I'm going to be taking notes today, but I'm not going to be able to share my screen, take notes, and manage the speaker queue all at once. So please go ahead and start, Paul, and I encourage everyone else to have the doc open. I believe, Paul, you're muted.
I'll share my screen, but I need a second to clean up my dirty laundry.
Cool. And Jimmy, the doc is always available. We usually screen share it, though, to help keep everyone on the same page in terms of what's being written down. So you'll be able to see it on the screen share. I'll be typing, but Paul, it will be on Paul's screen. So my notes will be effectively on the Zoom.
Okay, I just have to wait a second for Firefox to close around 100 tabs. All right. And sorry for the delay. I have a lot of stuff open. Okay. All right, I'm going to share my screen now. All right, can everybody hear, or can everybody hear my screen and see my voice?
Yes and yes.
Okay, so let's see, let's open this thing up. Okay, so there are 3 facets to this. Overall, the use case that we're trying to solve is that right now, there's basically a single relist interval for every broker that's a property of the controller, and that's not really enough. So the things that we want to enable are a explicit relist interval that's configured on a per broker basis. We also, and in addition to relisting on an interval, you should also be able to say that you only want to relist when a user manually says that it's time. And in addition to that, there's a desire to have a porcelain CLI command that will let you say something like kubectl service catalog relist broker name. So is everybody clear on that before I talk through the specifics of the proposal?
Yeah, sounds good. Go.
Okay. So basically, the proposal from an API standpoint is to add 2 fields to broker spec. One of them is the relist behavior, which is an enum that can right now be do it on a duration, or do it manual only. And then the next field is the relist duration, which is a MetaV1 duration, which if you're not familiar with that, it basically allows you to specify the interval syntax we're probably all familiar with, like 1H for 1 hour. And the how this would work from an API standpoint is that the default in this proposal is that the behavior should default to a duration, and the relist duration itself should default to, I chose a fairly arbitrary interval of 15 minutes. I would certainly like to discuss whether that's an appropriate value as a default. It's more of a straw man to start discussion on. And if you specify duration, every time that duration elapsed, the controller would go and relist the broker services, like do the get on the catalog endpoint and run the relist reconciliation logic, which is a separate issue for, by the way, as I've just remembered. And if you were to say manual only, you would only, the controller would only do that when the user specified manually that it should be done. So to handle the manual case, there will be a new REST sub-resource for brokers that would be like relist, which I am not sure exactly what the right verb would be. Probably post or a put to that sub-resource would result in the ready condition being cleared and the checksum. Sorry, I'm failing to remember if we have a checksum right now. I think Jeff has just added one, but if you were to hit this, sub-resource, it would make the broker look like it hadn't yet been reconciled and trigger the controller to go and fetch the catalog and reconcile again. So in the event that you had a duration configured for relisting a broker, you could just use this same endpoint, which is exactly what the CLI, the porcelain command would do, and manually relist off the schedule. At a high level, that's pretty much what the proposal aims to do and how it aims to do it. I wonder if folks have any reactions to this, other use cases they want to support. EOF from me.
Cool. So Niall, you had a hand up. Can you verbalize what you put in the chat?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So my question is that you need to store somewhere in the status last update timestamp, right, to reliably released. And also if the user invokes the sub-resource for relisting, you also need to set some field that to register the fact that relist was requested.
Yeah,
so that, you don't just synchronously process it, but you need to reliably retry relisting, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So and I think this is actually spelled out explicitly in the issue text, but I'll go ahead and explain it at that level of detail. So currently the ready condition has the last transition time field, and that stores at what point the broker became ready. This, it's sufficient for our purposes for this to just have that sub-resource to do the relist, clear the ready condition, and the controller will say, hey, I haven't worked on this yet. I'll go and relist it. But you're right, it's not processed synchronously. It basically, the manual endpoint makes the resource look like it hasn't been reconciled, and that's what triggers the controller to go and do it.
Okay.
Cool. Jimmy, you have a question. Can you verbalize that as well, please?
Sure. If you have a resource that you're taking advantage of, and then you request a relist, and it relists, and that resource is now gone from the broker, what actually happens then in the reconciliation?
So that's a really good question, and I believe there's actually a separate issue to deal with all of the corner cases of relisting. This is basically, the scope of this one is just about establishing the interval and the API constructions to let you do it, and not actually solving the problem of what happens when something weird, unexpected happens during a relist.
Do you think it makes sense to not have this on an interval then, and have it essentially on like API calls? So say I actually request to do an action, like I want to create an instance of this thing, and I specify a flag that says go out and relist. And that way you could have like an atomic like way to step through if you need to like roll back states. You can say this is what the list was before I tried to do this operation, and treat it kind of like in lockstep like that, rather than updated regularly on completely unrelated interval.
So the use case that we have for an interval is that when a new service is added to a broker, we, like at Red Hat, we have a use case where we're expecting brokers to routinely have new services that we want to consume on a regular interval. And I think that it's sufficient to support manual only, so that if you want to make all of your brokers in your instance of the catalog manual refresh only, you should be able to do that. I'm not sure exactly what you mean about a lockstep thing, but atomic semantics are very difficult to achieve in Kubernetes style APIs, just because of the nature of the system, right? Like, I think it might help the discussion, though, if you clarify your suggestion a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I'm just envisioning a world where I can say, create me this instance and update the list at the exact same time. So in case I know about an instance type that hasn't been synchronized yet, and then I can kind of make that coupled to one API call. Rather than, so I can say, like, give me the freshest view right now when you try to make this instance, rather than relying on an older view that's been there for 10 minutes maybe.
Yeah, so I think that part of what you're saying is doable, which I think what I hear when I say an API call to do the relist, that you would actually want to be able to create a special resource that indicated that a broker should be relisted, right?
Yeah, yep.
That part I think is doable. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's possible to synchronize or order those with respect to the instance creation.
Okay, interesting. Can you elaborate on that a little bit further?
Yeah, sure. So like the, say that I make this resource, which basically I'd want to post, I think, to the relist sub-resource, similar to how the binding resource and the core. And again, the naming collision haunts us. What I'm talking about is there is a resource called binding in the core API that is how the scheduler makes an assignment to a pod, from a pod to a node. And that has a special type that's basically a tuple of the node name and the pod's name and namespace, or it might even be UID. So it's possible to capture that in like an API level construction, but we have no notion of ordering in API operations. And you have to you have to basically anticipate that any API action might be taken at the same time with other API actions. So for example, if I had a resource to model the relist request and I created it at the same time as I made the instance, I would have basically no guarantee that the controller would be able to process the relist resource before it started working on the instance.
Gotcha.
Cool. All right, so Morgan has a hand up. Morgan, can you elaborate on what you put in the chat, please?
Yeah. Who's doing this automatic relist? Is that the controller?
Yeah.
Okay. Makes sense. Yeah, the only thing I would suggest is if we're tackling this, let's do the manual thing first. Get that semantics right before we start automatically doing anything and blowing stuff up.
Yeah. So I think that probably for now it's sufficient for us to get agreement on this. I do want to point out, in fact, that if we added this surface, and maybe we don't need to wait until the relist behaviors are fully figured out, because we already do the relist, so we're actually not making anything more broken. We're just controlling the interval effectively that we could break on. But
Yeah,
I do agree that we should definitely get the relist semantics figured out, and that might be a good topic for discussion this week. And
does the automatic? Do we do automatic relist, or is it we're trying to reconcile the initial state of the broker still?
No, we do an automatic relist. So like there's a flag on the controller that is like, this is the relist interval for the broker.
Right.
So it happens every so often.
Okay.
Right now anyway. This would just be making it configurable on a per broker basis.
Okay.
So what, just specifically here, what I see us talking about is not whether we should do the relist, but it's how do we expose API to
per broker.
Yeah, to the end user on a per broker basis to configure that automatic relist. And I would suggest that we try to put this on paper, put a final specification on paper that we can implement against this week.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to take an action item to write a specific proposal document for this. It's more than a GitHub comment. That will have, I think, Jimmy, your idea for having a resource is probably the right thing to do. A special resource type that you can post to this this endpoint, the sub-resource.
Yeah, I've just dealt with systems in the past that had things working off intervals and not really enjoyed it. So I kind of see that as an anti-pattern.
That's fair. I do want to note that if an operator has trouble with a particular broker, they can just update that broker spec and change it to manual only.
So let me put a suggestion out there. So Paul, would you take an action item then to work with Jimmy to come up with a solid proposal involving that extra resource? Get that proposal done this week so that we can talk about it by the end of the week, Thursday, and then move forward next week with implementation.
In fact, Jimmy, if you're comfortable taking this as an action item, this is probably a pretty easy starter one, because most of the semantics are already written out in this GitHub comment.
Yeah, I may or may not have time for that.
Okay.
Okay.
Can anybody commit to writing a proposal this week for the automatic and manual relist behavior?
I can commit to it. I would love to have another volunteer, but if no one else has the time, I am happy to do it.
Yeah, I can absolutely help. I just don't know if I can dedicate all the time towards doing it individually.
Okay. Would anybody else like to be part of this process, writing a proposal, and can commit to putting enough time forth to finishing it this week?
I'll read it.
Okay, so Morgan, can I put you down for a reviewer?
Sure.
Okay.
Okie dokes.
Let me just finish writing up this action item. Okay. Any other comments, questions, objections on this item? Going once? Okay. Next one, it looks like this is just a note to the group. Walter's going to present next week about the Alpha Blob Store. Walter, are you on the call by chance?
I am, although the investigation so far I've done is mostly that everyone agrees we should probably have one, but no one's actually stepped up to write the proposal.
Okay.
That fits with what I've heard from the API machinery folks at Red Hat.
Okay, so Walter, are you going to take any action sometime soon to either get a proposal out there or anything similar?
I was actually helping maybe a little to send out an email this week to Paul and see if I could start gathering requirements, since I think we don't have a solid idea of what the requirements are.
Okay, I think you can send that to myself and one David Eads at Red Hat, who I assume you have a passing familiarity with, and also to Aaron Schlesinger, who I believe you also know.
Back up for a second. It's probably the best idea is to put this on the Service Catalog Google group, soliciting use cases. And also, Walter, Jimmy has requested. Jimmy, do you want to just verbalize your request for him?
Sure. Can you just give us a short description of what this alpha blob store actually is?
Sure. So partly without the actual solid requirements, I'm just going to speak to API machinery's perspective. etcd's generally not good for large objects. It's also doesn't tend to have things like indexing, which I'm guessing is going to come in as one of the primary requirements. And API machinery would like to get to the point where we get other people's data out of our etcd instance, since we see with larger customers that too many users and data that isn't well behaved can cause problems for the Kubernetes core. So what we'd like to see is make something that's a little more generically useful for use cases that are not the API machineries, and get, in that way, convince people that they're better off over there than in our etcd instance. Does that make sense, or should I keep going?
Sure, it makes sense, but what are the consistency guarantees you're going to be providing through this, since it's not going to be going through consensus?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. This is the sort of thing we need to understand. Do we just provide an API and let everyone then get what they want, and what degree do these things? Like I said, this is early days and we need to get the requirements.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. So Paul, I think you have a couple things he's put your hand up for, so go ahead. You're still muted.
Nope. I put some comments in the chat saying that, Walter, it would be good when you create this message if you would cross-post with the API machinery. And then I made a joke about etcd killing the operator if you put more than 1 meg into an individual record. But I didn't use the hand thing, Aaron, because I didn't want to raise my hand.
Oh, that's cool.
That was a feature, not a bug.
Okay. I wanted to make sure we get that out there. So Walter, for soliciting feedback, I think it'd be good to put a post in our group, and then Paul would like it in API machinery. That would be perfect. I think you can put a timeline on it for how long you want to let use cases come in, and then you can come back to this group and or API machinery as well. Cool. All right. Any other comments, questions on the blob store topic? Going once. All right. Cool. Niall, you're up for API for Bear and basic auth support.
Yep. So currently we support only basic auth support, and the current types API is just having a link to the basic auth secret. And in order to add the support for other authentication types, currently just bearer token, we need to change this API. And currently, the way I address this is just by renaming basic auth secret to auth secret and adding an extra field secret type, which is essentially a enumeration type, which says whether it's a basic auth or bearer token. And Aaron has commented on the PR that one option is to not break API completely and just have bearer token auth secret field at the same level as currently we have basic auth secret. The other option is to, as I said, currently is just using secret type enumeration. And I think the third option is to make a union type more explicit and say that we have not basic auth secret directly, but have a basic auth section, and then have bearer token auth section, and then whatever other authentication type we want to support. And it will make it completely flexible and isolated from, so like if you want to work with basic auth, you jump into a particular branch of this type and you see that you need to specify the secret, something like that.
Cool. All right, Paul, you got your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm personally in favor of a union type for this because it's very tempting to feel like you could add a type field and that your existing fields would be portable. But I think that we have an example that is something that's a valid use case that would shatter the fields that we currently have. And that example would be in the case of if you wanted to do mutual TLS and have the broker authenticate the verify the TLS from the controller to the broker, you'd probably want to have a TLS option, which, as far as I understand, would have very different fields. So if you can frame a counterexample that we could do TLS with a secret name and key, that would be fine. But I think in general, my strong preference from previous API work in Kubernetes is to use union types, even when you are positive that you can get away with a type field that changes the behavior of other fields in an object spec. Because when you have a new example that you can't fit into, then you have to add a new top level field that's a sibling to all of those things, and the semantics get a little bit more complicated to reason about because not all fields are valid in combination with the type field. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. I'm fine with this, and I agree that currently secret type is basically an easy way to implement to make the change to support bearer auth token. But if we start using like X509 or any other authentication mode, it will be irrelevant because for some types of authentication we don't need secret at all, for example, and then secret type doesn't even make sense. So yes, I agree that probably it makes sense to just have a union type. I will still prefer to make a breaking change, as I said, to switch from basic auth secret to having a basic auth and then whatever is relevant inside this section.
Okay, what we could also do is we could add a new union type and keep the old field and say that the old field is deprecated and will be removed in the beta version of the API. And that way we don't have to break users, but we can let them know in advance that the field won't be sticking around.
So Jimmy, you put +1 in the comments field. Can you clarify what exactly you want a +1?
Yeah, just the last thing that Paul said sounds extremely fair to me.
So
is someone making notes? Sorry.
Yeah, I will make notes, but I want to be super clear on what exactly we are +1ing, because there's been quite a few proposals been put down in the last 2 minutes or so.
It sounds to me like what we're converging on is to add a new union type, keep the old field around, mark it deprecated in the comment on the field, and say that it'll be removed in the beta version of the API.
Okay, and the union type will be exactly what?
It'll support basic and opaque bearer token, and in the future we might add TLS or X509.
Alrighty. And Morgan, you've got a hand up, so go ahead.
Just to be explicit, maybe a no auth thing to consider.
Okay, would no auth fit into this new union type?
I figured maybe. I don't know. I'm just. That's what I was understanding of the union was, X or Y.
Well, if we omit this section entirely, would it be meaning no auth?
Yeah, that's what I want to make that explicit. Either say, oh, it's not there, then it's no auth, or it's explicitly set to be nothing, and that's no auth. So whatever the appropriate thing to do there is. That's all. I just want to make sure it's written down what the decision is.
Okay, Paul, you got a hand up.
I think now we have nothing is nothing. So
now we have nothing is nothing. It's totally possible to implement a nullary option for a union type. I personally think in this case nothing makes sense. I'd be willing to hear an argument for we should have an explicit nothing if somebody wanted to make one.
So Morgan, correct me if I'm wrong. Sounds like as long as we can support it, you're okay for now?
Yeah, no, I'll look at what comes out. That's all.
Okay. All right, so we've got the suggestion down here that sounds like Paul, Niall, and Morgan, you guys are all okay with this that I've written in the notes. First of all, does anybody have any objections to what I've written and what those guys have come up with? Going once. All right. So what I would suggest is for Paul, Niall, Morgan, and possibly others to take this idea, put it into a new proposal by this week as well, so we can get to implementing it by next week. Do any of you guys have objection to doing that?
I will make the change.
Okay.
Probably just today or tomorrow.
Sounds good to me.
So Niall, when you say you're going to make a change, are you going to make the change in that PR?
Yes, I will just update it.
Okay. I think that the PR already has this, but just in case I'm wrong, can you put in the initial post, the OP from the PR, exactly what is happening here with regards to the old field and the new field?
You mean to the description of the PR or where?
Yeah, to the description.
Okay.
All right, let me just write that action item down. All right. Okay. All right, it looks like there's one more here from Paul. This is also about a union type, but for supporting different modes of addressing service classes and plans. So Paul, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So we've had a few discussions about what the right mode of addressing service classes and service names, service classes and service plans is. The difficulty is that Open Service Broker API does not have a stable human readable coordinate to use. So the Open Service Broker API has an ID, which is supposed to be a GUID, but has very few semantics about format. There is a name field for plans and, I'm sorry, there's an ID for plans and classes. There's a name field for these entities too, but it's mutable. And Kubernetes resources do not have mutable names. So we've gone around and around about what's the right way to handle this. There's been discussion in, let's see if I have my issue numbers right, 802, and that's primarily where the discussion has been. It occurred to me this weekend that we've been falsely or arbitrarily constraining ourselves to try to find a one-size-fits-all solution for this problem, and I don't think that we actually have to do that. And so I will go ahead and open the the pull request, which I'll then link into the doc. Or I'm sorry, this is an issue, not a pull request. So in issue 1081, which I will go ahead and link into the agenda doc now, I propose a union type in the instance spec that will allow us to support different modes of where does a particular service instance come from. So the two modes that I propose that we initially support are, well, I should back up a second. A part of this proposal is that we use the Open Service Broker API ID of service class and plan as the name, and have a separate field for the human readable name. And the two modes that I propose that we support initially are to address using the Open Service Broker ID of the service and plan directly, and then also to have a mode where we reference using the human readable names. And so this way, we don't have to try to find a one-size-fits-all solution, and we can support these two different ways. And how I propose that the human readable names work is that, and I'm sharing so you can all see this. So when you just use the Open Service Broker IDs directly, there's a field in this union type that takes on the direct reference where you specify service class ID and service plan ID. And just for the record, none of these names that I've put on here are serious suggestions about what the names of the type should actually be. I'm certainly willing to discuss any naming folks want, but I wanted to get the concept out there. So when you use the Open Service Broker IDs directly, you just use the service and plan ID field of the union type, set service class ID and set service plan ID. And when you want to use the human readable names, you set the human readable names field of the union type and set fields on this human readable name struct that have the human readable names in them. This type also has fields for service class ID and service plan ID. And when you create a resource that uses this human readable name scheme, there will be an emission controller that dereferences the human readable name and sets it on the service class ID and service plan ID fields of this human readable name struct as it's being created, and then the controller can use those to do the work. So some points about this that I'll mention are that we should have some validations for this to make sure that only a single field is set, that you can't move from one scheme to another during an update, which I think might be doable in the future. For now, we definitely shouldn't do it because it seems like a rat's nest of corner cases to get into. And we should also make sure that a service that the service class ID doesn't change during an update, but this would support plan changes. In the human readable case, you'd just change the human readable name. The emission controller would set the service plan ID, and we could detect the change in the controller there to say, hey, we need to do a plan update. EOF.
Cool. All right, now you're up.
Yep. So it seems to me that this use case is very similar to how secrets are implemented. And they have two fields. One is with binary data, and one is with data represented as a text. And the text is write-only field. So for this use case, I think that service-readable names kind of have the same purpose. So for humans to easily reference the particular plan and class, they could be like, not write-only, of course, but still they are the key which are being used to resolve the actual IDs. So, and they don't use union types for this. So I'm just saying that there is a different way of doing this, and this is an option too.
That's a fair point. I suggested the union type in this case because I think there will be additional API constructions around where does an instance of a service come from that are easiest to implement if we use a union type now. And I personally think it's best to be explicit about what the original intent of the user was, which in the case of secret, you can't recover because the string data fields are write only. I would argue, and by the way, for anybody that isn't familiar, what Nail is talking about is the secret API resource has a data field that's a map of string to byte array, because secret has to be able to handle binaries, and JSON treats binary data as a byte array. Base 64 encoded, or I'm sorry, it's a byte array, so we can handle both binaries and strings. Byte arrays in JSON are treated as base 64 encoded strings, and so as a convenience, there's a string data field that allows you to specify string values that are only they're write only. So when you create a secret that populates the string data field, it results in the secret being created having those in the data field. You don't actually get the string data fields back out, which probably I can say this with certainty because I am actually the original creator of secrets, and I can tell you over the last 3 years I have learned that we made some naive design decisions, and in fact, we did not originally have the string data field. I think we would have done something a little different. That's kind of besides the point. I just have some baggage about it. Anyway, it is another flavor that we could do. My own preference would be to keep it explicit so that the user could see that their original intent was to capture or was to bind to, I'm sorry, make an instance of X or Y service class and plan. But I'd be open to hearing other arguments.
So Niall, I'll get to you in just 1 second. I would recommend that everyone go and read this very detailed proposal. It's like I said, very detailed, looks complete in terms of what Paul is suggesting. I'd recommend that everyone goes and does that as soon as they can so that we can talk about this in more detail. We may not need to do that, but it's important that everyone at least understands exactly what's going on here because this is a core part of the system. That's it from me. So Niall, go ahead. You had your hand up.
So yeah, basically, I will just to impersonate Doug, that he often says that this union type thing requires you to have an extra nesting in the API, which sometimes looks redundant. And I'm not saying that it is a bad thing, but it's just something we need to be aware of.
Actually, so in the proposal, the union type is inlined into the outer instance spec, so you don't need an extra nesting level. You just specify whichever type you want.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just typing one last little note here. All right. So for now, does anyone have any questions or comments about this point? Going once? Okay. So as I said, I think what I personally would suggest is that we all take an action item to go and read through this issue, post any comments or questions in the issue thread, and I will take an action item as well for myself to schedule further discussion on this issue for later this week, probably Thursday, so that we all have plenty of time to read through this. And then a final suggestion is to have us come to a consensus by the end of this week, such that someone can start implementing a prototype for it early next week. So does anybody, before we move on, does anybody have any concerns, questions, comments on what I just said?
Just a +1 on getting consensus on basically anything that we can. We're running out of issues that we actually had consensus on, so it would be good if we didn't have to stall development while we get more consensus. So let's keep that consensus factory humming away.
Okay. So since I've heard no since I've heard no objections, I'm going to put 2 action items down. One action item for everyone to go read the issue, either comment on the thread, or Morgan, as you said, since you find it irritating to comment on issues, make notes somehow, whatever your preference is. And I will as well take an action item to schedule further conversation for this issue later in this week, during which time we can all present our notes. And I will also make it a goal for all of us, remind all of us as well, to come to a consensus on this during the next meeting. Paul, I see you have your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, I also find commenting on GitHub to be irritating, but it helps achieve consensus faster if we can just bite the bullet and put comments into GitHub. I mean, otherwise you got to wait until you have a chance to talk about it, and then you got to go and, like, if there's feedback to address it. So I'd personally appreciate it if everybody who has an opinion on these subjects would be willing to comment on it in GitHub. But I do empathize with anybody that doesn't like the GitHub UI.
All right. Sorry, I'm writing some notes here on the action items. So as I said, everyone read the proposal thoroughly. Make notes, preferably in the GitHub thread, so that we can start addressing them early. And I will schedule further discussion on this for later this week. Paul, I see, did I address your hand up already? Okay, sorry, I forgot about that. All right. Does anyone have any final questions, comments, objections on this last point today? Going once? All right. Now, one final thing. Niall, you had a hand up on the second to last item we talked about that I never got to. I apologize for that. Did you want to go back and talk about that again?
I think we just discussed with Morgan that we need to document the way we work with authentication modes. I'm not sure if there is a documentation for basic auth yet. And if there is, then I will have to rewrite it and add the bearer token auth support.
Okay. I believe I commented in 1053 about changing the broker in the broker resource YAML in the contrib folder. That's at least one place. I'm not sure if it's the only place though that we document auth.
Yeah, I meant more formal text document, something.
Sure. So I would say my suggestion at least would be to go in 1053 and make that change. Does anyone else have suggestions on writing auth documentation, etc.?
The implementation PR where we do this would be a fine place to put the doc.
So Paul, are you referring to adding a new doc, or do you know of an existing doc?
There is no existing doc for this subject.
Okay, so do you suggest that Niall begins a new documentation, a new document that documents the auth modes?
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be incredibly exhaustive, but I think a brief doc about broker authentication would be fine.
Okay. Now, you cool with doing that?
Okay, yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay. I'll add that to the action item for the bearer and basic auth support PR, just so no one forgets. All right. With that, any final questions, comments about anything we discussed today from anybody? Cool.
All right.
All right. We will get 6 minutes back on the day.
Sounds good. See you all on the internet.